We're in the situation where the current standoff is a product of some major Russian military buildups that started last year and have really intensified in the last month or two. But really, the standoff really started back in 2014 with the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine, which essentially overthrew a pro-Russian president and replaced him with a pro-Western government. Russia's goal in Ukraine should be seen in line with its broader geopolitical imperatives. So first and foremost, for Russia, it's domestic political consolidation on the home front, which Putin has, arguably achieved over the last 2 decades or so. But stemming from that, you also have Russia seeking to protect itself in its neighborhood, whether that's from actual neighbors or from external powers. And then you have Russia basically trying to entrench its own influence in the region and beyond if it can. What we've seen in the case of Ukraine is a clash of those imperatives, if you will. Ever since Ukraine turned pro-Western, Russia's goals are basically to make it into a pro-Russian state or return it into the Russian fold. The concept of strategic connectivity, I think, is really important to mention here. And by strategic connectivity, I would define that as a combination of integration initiatives spanning the political, economic, security, and even cultural spheres that is basically coordinated by a state power to achieve long-term objectives. And this is something that Russia has been trying to do basically in the former Soviet space, and in particular in Ukraine, which is to try to connect these countries to its orbit, and which we've seen in situations like in Belarus, for example, or even in Kazakhstan, where Russia has economic ties there and they're willing to use military exercises, military cooperation, things of that nature to keep these countries into its orbit. Now, for countries that are outside of its orbit, such as Ukraine currently, then Russia can employ things to basically try to undermine the connectivity that Ukraine has with its own alignment bloc, which is the EU and NATO. So in this sense, strategic connectivity is really how we're seeing the current crisis play out. Certainly you have the option of conventional military action, that's what everybody is looking at right now. So Russia could decide, one option is to basically send its military forces into Ukraine, further into Ukraine, I should say, in order to basically offset Ukraine's Western security ties and its ambitions to join NATO. But you also have a number of hybrid tactics that Russia could and has been employing that's short of a conventional military action. Just the threat of the Russian military action can be seen as one element to achieve these goals. There's also cyber attacks, which we've now seen happen against Ukrainian government and economic websites, and then misinformation. So essentially, it's a combination of all of these things that Russia could and has been trying to employ to achieve its goals. Russia is engaged diplomatically through various negotiation formats with Ukraine and with the West. So whether that's with the OSCE and the Minsk talks that are happening, or whether that's the Normandy talks, which is the broader political component with Germany and France. These are all negotiating formats to try to achieve some kind of resolution or some kind of understanding to the Ukrainian conflict. The military moves that Russia is taking can be seen as basically part of the negotiation process. Russia flexing its muscles, if you will, threatening the potential for war as a means to get its objectives. In this case, for Russia, I think it's interesting and important to distinguish strategic connectivity from something like hybrid warfare. And actually, they have a lot of similarities, but there are some differences as well. So when people discuss hybrid warfare, we're talking about, the things that are not just conventional military tactics, but covert warfare, cyber attacks, disinformation, things of that nature. So strategic connectivity really broadens this concept out to include things like the economic sphere, diplomacy, and even technological or cultural elements. And this is something that Russia has been trying to do basically in the former Soviet space, and in particular in Ukraine. There's a number of things that the West and NATO are doing to try to deter and resist Russia currently. We've seen a significant ramp up in security support for Ukraine in the form of weaponry that countries like the US, UK, and some of Ukraine's neighbors like the Baltic states and Poland are sending to Ukraine in order to make it more prepared in the event that Russia does choose to move in. But then you also have the diplomacy that's happening, which is that the US and NATO allies are trying to basically back Ukraine diplomatically in these negotiation processes with Russia. So you have, both sides, essentially Russia and the West, conducting military exercises, threatening further actions, but actually trying to hammer things out at the negotiating table so it doesn't lead to the war that most people are trying to avoid. We're still in the point of diplomacy. Despite Russia's military buildups and the exercises that we've discussed, things are still in the diplomatic realm. Negotiations are ongoing. There's shuttle diplomacy of American and European leaders to basically meet and negotiate with Russia. But the threat of military action does remain. And here I would say that the fears of a large-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's still, I think, the last resort for Russia. So this deadline of today, February 16th, that some U.S. intelligence and officials have warned that could be the date for the Russian invasion, it hasn't happened. It's not to say that it couldn't happen in the future, but I think Russia is still very hesitant to take that final move. But we've seen some signals out of Russia in the political sphere, for example, with the Russian Duma essentially requesting Putin to recognize the separatist territories of DPR and LPR, Donetsk and Luhansk republics, as independent states. Putin has so far declined to do so because he said that if that were to happen, then it would essentially scuttle the entire Minsk negotiating process. But if Putin decides, or if Putin makes the calculus that he's not going to get any concessions out of Ukraine or out of the West that he's looking for, that's a really key element to watch for. Because if Russia were to recognize these independent states, that could lay the groundwork for further Russian deployments in a more official, conventional military capacity. And Putin could basically make the argument that if these states were recognized by Russia as independent, this wouldn't amount to a Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there's a number of things that can happen. I think we're going to see a lot of hybrid elements like we're seeing in the cyber attacks, a lot of misinformation, and then of course the continued buildups or the continued exercises by Russia and by NATO on both sides of Ukraine. But right now, as I said, we're still in the diplomatic sphere. Things could escalate, but there's also the potential for some kind of understanding to be reached.